Hi, everybody. So, over the past couple of weeks, we've been talking very much about extrinsic motivation and points, badges, leaderboards, and how to construct a system to gamify uh, an object. We've discussed also the definition of what gamification is, the use of game-like elements in non-game situations. But then we come across some alternate examples of gamification in the wild. This is an example called Man-Eater, and it was placed on a sticker placed on the window of a bus, and immediately in front of you was the instruction. What you had to do was close one eye, and then by moving your head, get the fish to move up or down on the window and try to get it to eat as many people's heads as possible. This is obviously a form of gamification. They're adding a game element to an otherwise non-game situation, riding a bus or a daily commute. However, it doesn't have an integrated point system. It doesn't have badges or social recognition. It doesn't have leaderboards. It really doesn't have any of the features of the more extrinsic motivation that we are used to. What it does have is it has the idea of narrative built into it, the idea of a story built into it, and an emerging story that is built into it. If we go back to the Malone's 1984, I believe it was the framework for intrinsic motivation in design, we find that storytelling is one of the ways that we can bring people into intrinsically designed motivation. So, if we're going to be using stories, we have to understand what a story is. And a story is made up of three major areas: the plot, the characters, the setting, and the setting. We're going to talk about the plot in some detail in this because I have some suggestions for how to plot a situation. We'll assume that the protagonist is the player character, and we'll move from there. And we'll touch a little bit on the idea and theme and the concept of storification that is used in some areas. Please remember that not everything is a story. If I was to say the king died and then the queen died, well, I do have characters there, but it's a recitation of facts. It's not a story. It doesn't give you a setting for it. It doesn't give a plot to it. It doesn't give any reasoning and the characters are very flat. This is something you want to avoid. Now, when it comes to game design, the theoretical component that is most commonly used is the monomyth by Joseph Campbell. And Joseph Campbell wrote a book in which he argued that there is one fundamental story that is retold and retold and retold in all manner of cases, where the hero starts off and in the everyday world, and then there's the call to adventure, the first threshold, the etc., and it cycles through. The monomyth is an incredibly popular format. You can see it in Star Wars. You can see it in Harry Potter. In fact, if you were to write the basic plot of Star Wars and put it beside the basic plot of Harry Potter, you could just take out keywords and change the keyword from, say, for example, Jedi to wizard, and potentially have the same synopsis happening, because the events follow a very similar pattern. There is a problem with this in both game design terms and in gamification design terms, in that because it is the most common being used, it has become a little predictable and a little almost trite. A slightly better resource to go to is to look at Christopher Booker. And Christopher Booker, in his book, The 7 Basic Plots, argued that there are different stories that tend to reoccur and different stories with different formulations. He went so far as to say not that there were 7 plots, but actually each one of these is doubled into a dark form where it's almost reversed, the perspective is almost reversed. The 7 plots he outlined were Overcoming the Monster, Rags to Riches, The Quest, Voyage and Return, Comedy, Tragedy, and Rebirth. And most importantly, in the 7 Basic Plots, he presented a short synopsis paragraph of each of these styles. And I recommend using this as a kind of pseudo-plotting for your story. What I mean by this is you take the basic plot outline that he has given and you examine it. So let's take an example. The Overcoming the Monster pseudo-plot. The player is in the world community X. When he becomes aware of the deadly threat of Y, who wants to destroy X, the player must gather resources, learn skills to prepare to confront Y. Just as everything is going well, Y strikes, and the player must fight with no guarantee of success. When victory is achieved, X is saved. Let's contrast that to the Voyage and Return. The player is thrown into strange world X. At first, X is puzzling and unusual as the player tries to figure out the rules of this new world. Slowly, however, X begins to change and become more frustrating, difficult, or dangerous. Just as the world X starts to become a serious threat, the player finds an escape, having been changed by the experience. As you can see, these are 2 very different plot forms and formulations. The first one would be very useful if you're designing a short form of gamification, a contained form of gamification, where there is going to be a challenge at the very end. Whereas the second one is much more explorative and much more encouraging people to go through the world around them. So by realizing that there are these different pseudo-plots, we can manage to understand the best way to leverage them into our creative process. Next thing to talk about in terms of story is the narratology and the idea of kernels and satellites. Kernels are the things that make the story the story. They are, no matter how you retell Little Red Riding Hood, there has to be a bad guy who meets Little Red Riding Hood somewhere and then rushes ahead to do something bad to another person. Those are the key elements that make Little Red Riding Hood Little Red Riding Hood. You can't have that story without those key plot points, those key moments. And these are the kernels of the story. The satellites, however, are the things that can be omitted or altered without affecting the key points. Does it really matter if Little Red Riding Hood is confronted by the big bad wolf or the big bad tiger? In Korean tradition, a lot of the stories are told with the tiger being the bad guy. However, when these were translated into Japan, which doesn't have tigers didn't have tigers occurring on it naturally. These stories got changed to being a monster or a wolf or a demon. So these issues that can be omitted, altered, without affecting the major idea of the story. Understanding where your kernels are of your story helps you with placing and pacing the story out and to understand what bits and pieces can be done in what way. So Espen Arseth, in A Narrative Theory of Games, took a look at using kernels and satellites as a way of breaking down what is happening inside of the game. If there is no player influence on the kernel and no player influence on the satellite, it's a completely linear story. You may as well be reading it. If there's nothing that the player can do to change a detail, then there's nothing that can happen with it. It's just reading. So understanding the satellite and being able to allow players to manipulate satellites will allow us to create a linear game. If the player can choose alternative kernels, but hasn't any influence on the satellites, you end up with a non-linear story, a story which branches and can be read through any different perspective. But it's not really a game. If you have it possible to influence both, you end up with a quest game. If you have full influence on the satellites, as in the player can create the satellites that they want, and they can't influence, the player has full influence on the kernels that they want, and not possible to change elements via the satellites. This is a misnomer, a thing that is almost physically impossible. And with full influence on the kernel, and influence on the satellites, you end up with a emerging property game and a story. So understanding how this story is put together, understanding the pseudoplot, and then understanding where am I going to give my players agency, where am I going to give the people engaged in the system the ability to make decisions, and how meaningful are those decisions going to be, can dramatically improve the intrinsic motivation that you're achieving. So we've talked a little bit about plot, we've talked a little bit about organizing them. We should talk a little bit about theme. And theme is a semiotic domain that a design evokes or is about. And it's the thing to hold how to explain this? It's the messages that are encoded in the imagery or the words that instantly make the person go, aha, so this is this type of world. In game design and in set design, you have to rely on very specific imagery to evoke these ideas, to make it clear what the world is about as quickly as possible, because there's only so much time that the player has to get into it. We have 5 images here that I've pulled at random, each of which evoke a different theme. Understanding and playing with theme becomes important if you're playing with intrinsic motivational design. There are some problems with using a narrative approach, however. And the biggest one is that stories have to end. For a story to be meaningful, it can't go on forever. So if you're looking to trap somebody in a Skinner box continual feedback loop for eternity, using a story is possibly going to be problematic with it because we want the story to come to an end. The themes that you use, I will admit that there is no way you will ever get me to play a game with My Little Pony in it, not because of the nature of the game, but because I'm not a fan of that particular genre and that particular theming. So this can attract or push away specific audiences. You got to decide on the plot structure that fits with the system that you're designing, because if you have a disconnect between the two, you can end up with a serious problem. You have to provide agency within the story for it to truly be a game, and emergence and the meanings that people bring to the story will change the way that the story develops into the future in ways that are beyond the control of the creator of the system. Okay, so as always, if you have any questions, drop me a line on the emails or send me a message on the forums on Moodle. Next, we're going to be looking at how we analyze a gamification system. Specifically, we're going to be looking at Octalysis, which is from Yukai Choi, and we're going to look at how that can be used to define a system or to look at the system boundaries around a system and to judge it based on the criteria that he has identified. Thank you very much for listening all the way through, and everybody please stay safe.